Thank you. There's a challenge for the chair this afternoon because my time is right now out. But I will be very brief. This is not a proper presentation. I will only do a few remarks given my own background and my perspective. I'm an associate professor in the sociology of religion. I have never specifically worked on free will or consciousness, but I've been running this institution for 16 years. And we have had lots of dialogues resembling the one we're having today. So in that sense, I've been interested in some of these questions. And I will only have a few basic observations. The first obvious one, why sociological perspectives? My first point is that humans become what they are in and through interaction, human interaction. One of the best explanations of how we become human beings is found in George Herbert Mead and the Chicago School. But it's a fact that we do not develop as isolated individuals, we develop as social beings. We also maintain our conception of reality in the context of human communication and human interaction. It's inconceivable for us to be humans, to act as humans, to think as humans, if we were not part of a human community. And what puzzles me many times is that when we talk about free will and we talk about consciousness, we seem to talk about the single brain. And given a social perspective, that's not quite understandable, because if we look at one brain, we only look at one singular element in a very large system. So the system itself has to have some meaning. The second point is that sociology itself is not without internal contradiction. In sociology, we typically measure general patterns in large populations. When we do so, we also try to understand variation in terms of independent variables. But there's also a tendency to also, at least implicitly, think of individual variation as the result of individual choice, which, in a sense, could be called free will. I would like to point to a personal anecdote. I once, long time ago, did a study on the reception of a specific religious television program. My research has been focused on the interplay between media, religion, and culture. And I was using a television program from South Africa and was showing it to people in the United States and in Sweden, trying to figure out how the people who saw the program made meaning out of the program that they just have seen. This is the communication model I work with. You don't have to pay too much attention to the model itself. The only basic thing is that the individual has an internalized repertoire of meaning systems, and that's the resource the person has for creating meaning. Then obviously the external context, whatever that is, has a significant impact on the meaning-making process in the individual. Thirdly, there is an internal context, meaning, emotions, and all kinds of things, but also possibly the individual choice. And it's kind of interesting because in my model, it was not conceivable that the individual would create something completely new, but the individual could respond to what was given within in terms of the internalized repertoires of meaning systems. This caused a discussion because if we could map all relevant independent variables, would that mean that we could explain all the individual variation? And this was an interesting discussion because it was not empirically possible to answer. And it seems to be a circular argument. If you think that there is a possibility for the individual to have impact on the meaning-making process, you create room for that, and if you don't, you do not create room for that. So for instance, one of my colleagues said that there is no possibility for the individual to have any impact individually on the meaning-making process. It's all determined by factors around the individual, which is more a statement of faith or an assumption, because it's not empirically possible to investigate. And I took another position, allowing for some degree of possibility for the individual to have impact on the meaning-making process. So this was just trying to, in a few minutes, say that when we talk about consciousness, when we talk about free will, we need to consider that the human being is part of a system of human beings, and that has impact on what we study. Not necessarily does it make things easier, but I think that those dimensions are unavoidable. That's my short introduction. Now I'm very happy that Tom Burns is going to have a proper presentation, so I will conclude this.
Well, thank you very much. Thank the organizers, Yuri and Hans, and also Al for his role, Alice for responding very quickly. I'm amazed how quickly she gets things done. And I was going to make some comments about comparing our conference with the conference that takes place in Tucson, Arizona every year, which my wife and I participated in several times. I have some good stories about it that will take too much time. As I said in the note that I sent out with the paper, I just might mention Nora Machado is associated with Gothenburg University. She was an associate professor there for a number of years. And the other person working with me is Alexandra Walker from the Faculty of Law at the Australian National University. As I said, the paper is based on a scientific paradigm, which Alf has suggested on his own presentation. Very different than most of the paradigms and approaches of the other papers in this conference. It draws on social philosophy, in particular the American pragmatist, social science theoretical, empirical, and policy research, and systems science articulated in social science terms. Systems science, years ago, in the early work of the cybernetics and so on, stressed very much the role of information as opposed simply to matter. And in the sociological research, you're always dealing with information, knowledge, culture, institutions, and so on. I also might add that, of course, the paradigm I'm presenting starts with the social group and the community. Humans are social animals above all. Language, interaction, communication, shared rules and symbols, shared representations, and normative concepts, which make occasions like this predictable, orderly. So actually, there is a lot of predictability that the social sciences have identified, have discussed, and so on. But it's not perfect. It's predictability under some conditions. You have periods of revolutionary change, where you have increased unpredictability and increased disorder. And we're in one of those periods now, which is another topic, but I simply want to stress this issue of predictability came up, and often it's said that the social sciences have very low predictability. In fact, they have very high. But again, under certain conditions. I've already said some of this, the importance of information domains, beliefs, values, decisions, plans, etc. And the kind of consciousness that we work with is consciousness as reflective activity. And the kind of framework we work with allows us to get at it. We're not talking about sentient consciousness or awareness consciousness. Some of you know much more about this kind of thing. We're talking about reflective consciousness. We also conceptualize bounded free will. We stress the bounded because of the constraints, the material, the social, the psychological constraints on free will. And free will plays a role in reflective consciousness, typically together with other normative concepts, such as equality, fairness, justice, moral responsibility, rationality, irrationality. Free will as part of reflective consciousness is operationalized in the description and assessment of choices made or not made by relevant actors. Or it's also appearing in accounts about attention to and the development of strategies to resist coercion, to overcome habitual forms of bad behavior, or in temptations to break important norms, etc. In our perspective, free will presupposes reflectivity. It is a meta-concept applied in reflections on actual or planned choices, actions, developments, and so on. I already mentioned the first point about the particular kind of consciousness we're interested in. Such consciousness is based on shared rules and symbols, in a particular language, and the human capability to communicate and to create shared concepts and representation. I'm going to skip. I'm going to make the point that such collective consciousness, based on the use of common language and communication capabilities, precedes individual consciousness. That is, individual consciousness emerges from collective consciousness. In this paper, we refer to examples of collectively produced reflections and their experience and influence in collectives. Among such productions are public accounts, annual reports of businesses, public agencies, and other organizations, protocols of group meetings, and also we can observe societal reflexivity. And in the collective giving and asking of accounts among groups and family members, or among some of their members. These processes involve the use of given language, particular categories, and oral and written communication among the membership. Key components in our model are community, or group, organization, language and shared systems of grammar, language-based communication, collective representations, self-conceptions, and self-referentiality, particular institutional and cultural arrangements to produce, examine, assess, modify, and record reflections. We see this when groups refer to we, our group, our community, our values, our beliefs, our judgments, our prejudices, if we're starting to be critical of ourselves, our plans and our expected scenarios, our history, in the discussions and critical reflections and planning of any group. So it's understood as group activities, observing, monitoring, judging, and reorienting and reorganizing the self considering what characterizes itself. What are we? How are we different in our meetings from those in Tucson? And there's a big difference, a very big difference. Although many of us would also be participating in the Tucson conference. But we don't have any gurus here. We have no drug pushers, and so on and so forth. All kinds of little meditation early in the morning, etc. So, but it's sociologically, it's very interesting. I would say more interesting than here. But here, this is intellectually, scientifically interesting. So the reflectivity is encoded in language and developed in narratives or discourses about collective selves. Individual consciousness is the individual experience of consciousness, self-representation, self-reference, self-reflectivity, self-development, and so on. Again, some of the same processes that go on in the group. But we learn from the group, we learn in our families. I don't think I see that note, but I have a note about how the child at first, the youngster, participates in various groups and multiple groups and learns to be reflective. The child learns, oh, my name from the family, my name is, I want that. I don't want this. Learns to, or what do I want? Learns this kind of reflectivity. Such reflectivity is also observable personally and socially in preparation of the Catholic Church for the performance of the sacrament of confession. You have to learn what the sins are, how to count them, and so on and so forth, as you talk to a priest in the confession. Or in preparing and communicating with a psychiatrist about one's thoughts and behavior, using appropriate categories and explanations. Or the giving of accounts in families and groups about one another. Grandmother's birthday at 70 is very important. At 80 even. And if you're not going to the big dinner, you're going to have to give an account why you were not there. You have to have a very good reason. Well, there are multiple modes of individual consciousness. Also, as we do, we study pre- and subconscious levels. And all this points up the complexity of the human mind and in part of its elaboration through processes of social interaction and structure, to echo Alf's statement about why sociology has something to say about this. Group reflective activities are observable in all accounting. And we provide some examples. We have an appendix taking up the case of Exxon's annual report, and also internal discussions in Exxon, where Exxon went from being one of the major producers of climate change data, climate change models, etc., until the mid-80s. And they made a decision to stop and to support deniers, using their vast resources to start a campaign of deniers, which is a major development in the United States, as those from the United States know, but also we in Europe observing this. And then a few years ago, there was a task force set up in Exxon to reflect on their policies. It was chaired by the CEO himself, who is now the Foreign Minister of the United States. And the task force decided to change the policy. And it has. And you can see it in the recent annual reports, which are quoted here. I have also something there about gender justice law as a case of collective consciousness. In the work of Walker, she explains the emergence and development of international law relating to gender justice. The development of institutions, of organizations, and so on, that are part of this innovation, which I'll come back to at the end. In general, the theory of collective consciousness presented here can be applied to socially constructed collective selves. Partnerships, families, communities, national and international organizations, and so on. I won't go into what the unconscious elements are and how they operate, but there is selectivity in collective consciousness. Certain things are left out or even suppressed. This may be only for the outside, what sociologists call the front stage. Exxon developed the front stage and the backstage, whereas when it came to climate policy, before there was not a difference. Their scientists were participating in meetings, collaborating with climate scientists all over the world. One of their ships was collecting data from everywhere in the world on emissions, levels of emissions, and so on. But how do we find out about the unconscious? Well, Freud suggested some of the ways. The slips of the tongue, jokes, and so on. Some of this is referred to in the conclusions about men and women. Free will and reflectivity. To put it very simply, a choice sets us up to choose between two or more courses of action under conditions of constraint. That's why we talk about bounded free will. And we provide examples, as well as failures at such exercise. Following a norm, following a role. Again, whether to conform to it, to its expectations or demands or not. Making market choices, which we've had some discussion of here. And creative and innovative actions, where there is a freedom of creating something new and different. Very characteristic of human history and human development. It's not a pure abstraction, though. It's embedded in one or more groups, communities. That is, one needs to keep in mind the social, material, psychological context of instances of free will, of bounded free will. The normative concept is carried and practiced by members of a community, even if they don't have the concept. You know, they don't necessarily have it as part of their reflective machinery, but they're doing it. Can be observed. It is a potentiality that may be utilized by agents to varying degrees, depending on their judgments of a given situation and so on. So I mentioned following a norm. You can do that thought experiment in your head, or playing a role, whether to perform the role in the proper way, whether to innovate or not. In one appendix, some of the factors operating in social life, which explain why we adhere to or accept and follow rules and rule regimes and expect others to do so, are listed. Some of it has to do with interest, self-interest, gains that can be made. But a lot of it is because our identities are connected to those regimes. Agents may choose to disobey and refuse to follow laws, thereby reducing predictability and social order for others. EU policymaking is illustrated there. There were major shifts in paradigms in the EU concerning gender, concerning food, as food went from being a commodity that was market thing to being a security and health issue. Reorganization, new concepts, etc. Chemicals, energy, and so on. Following relatively open societal procedures, open-ended procedures such as voting, adjudication and administrative decision-making, multi-agent negotiation, all of these have a place for bounded free will. Creativity and innovation. Okay. The concluding remarks. The concept of bounded free will, the openness of individuals, organizations assures that a principle of bounded free will operates. We're not closed systems. We would never survive if we were. The social science turn to human agency as opposed to purely structural approaches lends support to using the concept of bounded free will. Free will presupposes reflectivity, as I said in the beginning. It's operationalized in the consideration, description, and assessment of choices made or not made by relevant actors, or in accounts that we have to give or that we ask others to give about why they did or did not follow a norm, why they did not go to grandmother's birthday party, why they do not resist coercion, or why they're still in their habitual forms of shopping and living when we're experiencing the destruction of the earth. Well, I mentioned Walker's work. I'm going to say, concerning the development of gender justice and gender law in both our countries but also globally, it's a major sociocultural innovation, especially if you bear in mind the terrible, in the reflection of the terrible situation of women in most developed countries 100 years ago. And still the situation of many women today in large parts of the world. Let's stay focused collectively and reflect in this and other areas in better ways and more effective ways to live as social beings on a very limited planet. Thank you.